In far western China, at the edge of the largest desert in Asia, is the oasis called Dunhuang. Once one of the most strategic fortifications along the Great Wall of China and a vital trading post on the legendary Silk Road. A cultural melting pot of merchants and monks, Dunhuang was one of China's earliest Buddhist centers, where 800 caves are decorated with exquisite murals. This forgotten fortress from an ancient past is now a symbol of China's greener future. Shining in the searing heat, deep in the land of the dragon. The deserts separating China from Europe and Western Asia are some of the most hostile environments on the planet. Yet men once crossed this land of death in search of riches. Braving temperatures of more than 120 degrees, epic sandstorms, and marauding bandits, camel caravans traveled along the most important thoroughfare in the ancient world, the Silk Road. The Silk Road was a transcontinental route linking the Roman Empire with the imperial court of China. The Silk Road was the information superhighway of its age, serving as the conduit not only for goods, but also for the transmission of knowledge and ideas between East and West. The Silk Road is a misnomer, for it was actually many roads, originating in towns and cities all over eastern China, but all converging on one ancient city, the oasis called Dunhuang. Situated at a crucial crossroads at the edge of the Gobi Desert, Dunhuang was one of the westernmost cities in ancient China and was a key supply base for caravans moving along the Silk Road for more than 1,000 years. In the 2nd century AD, the high fortified walls of Dunhuang contained a population of over 30,000. Business was good. In Chinese, the words Dun and Huang mean brilliant and prosperous. Traders in Dunhuang were middlemen, making handsome profits, because very few merchants traveled the full length of the Silk Road. Extending 4,000 miles, the Silk Road was actually an extensive network of routes connecting China to the Mediterranean. The sheer distances between cities meant it took years to complete the whole journey, over routes that were often little more than rough caravan tracks. Goods changed hands many times. Merchants, keeping within their own well-known territories, would meet, sell their items, and if lucky, return home, because their routes were perilous and plagued by bandits. So it was often with great relief that traders approached the safety of Dunhuang and the Chinese border. Today, visitors can catch a glimpse of life in Dunhuang 2,000 years ago at a recreated border crossing. Every merchant, foreign emissary, and pilgrim had to pass under the watchful eye of the Dunhuang border guard before they could travel in or out of China. There was always a strong military presence in Dunhuang, partly to deter the ever-present threat of bandits who took advantage of the wild terrain to plunder unguarded caravans. Anybody who wanted to leave the empire to travel abroad had to visit the commandant's office to apply for an ancient passport. These bureaucrats were the world's first paper pushers, as paper was invented in China during the Han Dynasty. Dunhuang marked the limits of civilization, separating the organized Chinese world from the barbarians of the West. To leave the safety of the walls was to venture into culturally alien lands. 1,300 years ago, the barren wasteland inspired Wang Wei, a poet of the Tang Dynasty, to write, "Drink another cup of wine, I bid you, for you will see no more friends out west." Surrounded by enemies, the first fortifications in Dunhuang were built as early as 121 BC. Within 10 years, a military colony of 2,000 soldiers extended fortifications beyond the city. Today, Dunhuang is surrounded by the remains of several ancient forts and watchtowers, built to support garrisons at key passes along the Silk Road. The Yardang fortress was once a grain store supplying the desert garrisons. The walls, 20 feet high and 5 feet thick, have survived for 2,000 years. Successive dynasties spent extravagant amounts of money building and maintaining the fortifications of Dunhuang, and not just to protect caravans from pirates on the Silk Road. For centuries, China had been under threat from hordes of mounted nomads that ruled Central Asia. The only thing between the raiding parties of fearless horsemen and the heartland of China was the garrison at Dunhuang, standing on the greatest wall the world has ever seen. In ancient China, enormous caravans of up to 1,000 double-humped Bactrian camels traveled the Silk Road to reach Dunhuang on the empire's western frontier. desolate deserts held many perils, but the greatest of all were the nomadic people called the Shunu. Today, the fearless horsemen from Central Asia are long forgotten. But in the 3rd and 4th century BC, the Shunu were such a menace to the Chinese Empire, they brought about the creation of the greatest defensive fortification the world had ever seen. At the time, China was divided between many warring states, so Shunu raiding parties sweeping in from the desert encountered relatively weak opposition as they destroyed crops, seized farm animals, and took prisoners as slaves. But in 221 BC, everything changed. Having conquered all the independent states, Qin Shi Huang declared himself the first emperor of a unified China. To protect his realm from the nomadic hordes in the north and west, the emperor came up with an ambitious plan. There were many small fortifications spread across the western frontier, built by independent states to defend their towns and cities. The emperor decided to connect them all together, forming a continuous barrier along his threatened borders. A determined band of barbarians could have scaled the walls, but they wouldn't have been able to carry their horses with them. And horses were a vital part of the nomadic Shunu's military success. In Dunhuang, a replica fortress complete with siege engines and spiked defenses illustrates the sophistication of the 2,000-year-old fortification. It was a precursor to the massive structure known today as the Great Wall of China. Successive dynasties spent the next 2,000 years continuing to build the greatest defensive wall the world had ever seen. A vast stone dragon with its tail in the deserts of Dunhuang and its head in the ocean. "1,600 miles from Dunhuang, the Great Wall extends 60 feet into the Bohai Sea. It's the biggest man-made structure on the planet, costing more than 1 million lives, and the modern equivalent of $360 billion. The most enthusiastic wall builders were the Ming Dynasty, who spent 300 years constructing the most elaborate and complete defensive walls the world has ever known. Typically, the wall was 20 feet wide at the base, 16 feet wide at the top, and a towering 25 feet tall. The Ming used about 78 million cubic yards of brick and stone to create their immense fortifications. The stone came from quarries, chipped into blocks using metal chisels and hammers, and then manhandled up the mountains. The bricks were made on site. If clay wasn't available, dirt would be mixed with water, packed into wooden frames, and fired in beehive-shaped kilns. But in the deserts of Dunhuang, there was no stone, no clay, and no real dirt. Military architects had to find ways to take advantage of the local building materials, sand and sticks. Workers laid a bed of willow reeds at the bottom of a wooden frame, and then filled the frame with a mixture of water, sand, and fine gravel. Compacted and left to dry, it formed a solid slab, strengthened by the willow reeds, just as modern concrete is reinforced by steel rods. The building material was so durable that more than 2,200 years later, the remains of a few broken sections of the Great Wall still exist in the desert near Dunhuang. Originally over 12 feet high and more than 6 feet wide, the wall was built up layer by layer, 6 inches at a time. Much more than just a barrier of earthen blocks, the wall was also a communications path, with runners moving over its top from one station to another, passing on messages. The wall was also used as an elaborate alarm system. Troops quickly sent news of enemy attack using signals of smoke or fire from a network of beacon towers. In the desert around Dunhuang, a small beacon would typically be built every 1.5 miles, a large beacon every 3 miles, and a fortress every 18 miles along the wall. Several towers, distorted almost beyond recognition, still stand in the lonely desert. The arid conditions have helped preserve the ancient structures, but blasted by sandstorms, some stretches of the Great Wall have been reduced to mounds of dirt. Sand and wind are the relentless enemy of archaeologists, the scouring grains erasing the ancient past. Yet Dunhuang is one of the world's greatest repositories of Buddhist art, the priceless treasures half buried by the shifting sands of time. The ever-shifting sands of ancient China's western frontier are an unlikely place to find a treasure trove of extraordinary art. But Dunhuang, once a thriving Silk Road oasis, was a vital thoroughfare for commerce, conquest, and ideas, both artistic and religious. In the first 3 centuries AD, many religions traveled along the Silk Road, but none influenced China as deeply as Buddhism. At Dunhuang, intrepid monks stopped to learn the Chinese language and culture, forming the nation's earliest Buddhist communities. Over the centuries, generations of monks also created one of the great marvels of the Buddhist world, hidden behind a riverbed lined with poplar trees, in a mile-long arc of sandstone cliffs, 100 feet high. Carved into the rock face are 492 caves. Each cave contains extraordinary statues and murals spanning 10 centuries of Chinese civilization. a collection so unique that in 1987, the Mogao Caves were named a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But the caves had humble beginnings. There were no holes in the cliffs until 366 AD, when a wandering monk searching for enlightenment in the desolate desert had a vision. The monk saw a golden light, as if 1,000 Buddhas were glowing on a cliff face in the desert. He took the vision as a sign. Here you must stay. So he cut a hole in the sandstone wall and moved in. The monk's meditation cell was little bigger than a coffin, adorned with a statue of Buddha. Soon, word spread, and other monks joined him, digging their own caves for prayer, rest, and meditation. Later, monastic communities began carving out larger caverns for public acts of devotion. Construction continued well into the 14th century. At its peak, there were over 1,000 openings chiseled into the rock face, nicknamed the Caves of the Thousand Buddhas. The wandering monk's vision in the desert had finally come true. Pilgrims started visiting the Mogao caves to pray, either for safe passage across the dreaded deserts of the Silk Road, or to give thanks for a successful journey. Eventually, wealthy and powerful patrons started paying people to create more elaborate temples within the caves. Artists and sculptors were commissioned to decorate the interiors with beautiful images of Buddhism. New caves, each more magnificent than the last, became a time capsule of the Silk Road. Using river mud mixed with straw as their canvas, Dunhuang's artist recorded the evolution of Chinese art and the transformation of Buddhism into a Chinese faith. Today, 492 caves contain exquisite murals that cover nearly 500,000 square feet of wall space, some 40 times the expanse of the Sistine Chapel. In contrast to the bleached desert outside the caves, thousands of Buddhas of every color radiate across the grotto walls, their robes glinting with imported gold. The most important mural in this cave is called the Forest of Recovered Eyesight. It tells the story of 500 robbers who, having been captured by troops, are blinded and sent into a forest. Eventually, they convert to Buddhism and finally regain their eyesight, showing that a person, no matter how evil, can confess and repent to ultimately reach enlightenment. The cave interiors are also adorned with more than 2,000 sculptures, some of them among the finest of their era. The grotto's biggest Buddha, a colossal 116 feet high, is the third largest Buddha in the world. When the Silk Road was abandoned by the Ming Dynasty, Dunhuang lost its importance, and the treasure trove within the Mogao caves lay undisturbed, protected by the dry desert air and its secret location. While never completely abandoned by Buddhist monks, the caves were largely forgotten until the early 1900s. Today, more than 500,000 visitors a year come to see one of the greatest underground art galleries in the world. Visitors are limited to a rotating set of 50 caves, 30 of which are open at any given time, because moisture from the people's breath damages the murals. A team of 500 conservators, researchers, groundskeepers, and guards battle to preserve the artworks for future generations. Outside the caves, the biggest enemy is sand. Over the centuries, many caves have been irretrievably damaged by sand blown in from the desert. Angled fences on the dunes above the cliff reduce wind speeds by half, decreasing the encroachment of sand by 70%. Dunes cleared by bulldozers are stabilized by planting wide swaths of desert grasses. The glories of the Mogao caves will always be threatened by an ever-encroaching tide of sand. And yet, sand can create wonders of its own. Not far from Dunhuang is the strangest national geology park in all of China, an extraterrestrial landscape that's also found on the planet Mars. The road to the ancient Chinese city of Dunhuang passes through the most expansive arid region on the Asian continent. 500,000 square miles of desolation called the Gobi Desert. In Mongolian, the word Gobi means very large and dry. According to legend, the desert was created when the armies of the Chinese emperor were pursuing a great Mongolian warrior. Desperate to escape and well-versed in the art of black magic, the fleeing warrior put a spell on the land, calling up great storms that buried the country in sand, forming an impenetrable barrier. The warrior was saved, and the Gobi was born. One of the driest areas in Asia, the Gobi sits in the shadow of the Himalayas, which block the arrival of moisture-laden monsoons. It's one of the most landlocked places on the planet, at least 1,000 miles from the nearest ocean. The desert is bone dry, has lots of sand, and is very windy. Perfect conditions to create a unique geological structure called a Yardang. The name for the streamlined wind-eroded sculptures comes from the Turkestani word yar, which means ridge or steep bank. Typically 3 or more times longer than they are wide, a Yardang resembles the prow of an upturned ship. Micro Yardangs can be just a few inches long, while mega Yardangs can stretch for miles, etched out of the desert by constant abrasion from the prevailing wind. The planet Mars has Yardang ridges on a massive scale, eroded by winds reaching speeds of 200 miles per hour for more than 100,000 years. Some geologists have suggested the Great Sphinx at Giza in Egypt may be a modified Yardang. The higher head end of a Yardang faces into the prevailing wind, its aerodynamic body literally sandblasted by the desert. Tiny particles driven by gale force winds scour the bedrock, cutting down into low areas, producing a series of parallel ridges which are gradually further eroded into separate hills. That's why most Yardangs occur in fields, often called fleets, because of their resemblance to inverted ship hulls. One of the biggest fleets in the world is found in the Dunhuang Yardang National Geologic Park. Formed in 2001, the park contains an incredible variety of Yardang sculptures, packed into an area only 15 miles wide and 1 mile deep. The locals have a different name for the region. As the wind passes between the sculpted rocks, it moans eerily, which is why for centuries it's been called the City of Ghosts. In spring, the wind brings more than just strange noises from the desert. When the ground warms up, the air above it rises, creating fierce northeasterly gales that carry with it the particles of sand that carve the Yardangs. As a geological force, in most places, wind is not as strong as ice or water, but the winds of the Gobi can be extreme. So much sand can be carried in the gale, the locals refer to black storms when the day turns to night. Sand from the Gobi Desert can be blown as far as western North America. Driven by the wind, the Gobi Desert is expanding. Its southern edge is smothering over 1,000 square miles of grassland every year. But in Dunhuang, people are used to the shifting sands. They live beside another of the most feared deserts in Asia, the Taklamakan, also known as the Sea of Death. "2,000 years ago, Dunhuang was China's most important trading post on the western frontier, a desert oasis where east once met west. Today, Dunhuang is threatened by very modern demands. A dam built over 3 decades ago to help local farming, combined with a doubling of the population, have overstressed a fragile desert ecosystem. Farming in Dunhuang dates back more than 2,000 years to the Han Dynasty. A map detailing the region's critical water sources was found among tens of thousands of manuscripts stored inside the Mogao caves. For more than 40 years, local farmers have redirected water to feed their crops. As a result, in some places, the underground water table has fallen by as much as 35 feet. In Dunhuang, water is life because it sits next to the largest shifting sand desert in the world, the Taklamakan. So many people have perished in the Taklamakan Desert, the Chinese call it the Sea of Death. And the sea is expanding ever closer to Dunhuang, and one of its most remarkable treasures. This row of withered trees once flourished around the geological wonder called the Crescent Moon Spring. A miraculous oasis in the harsh desert, the pond, fed by spring water, is shaped like a crescent moon, although parched travelers said it resembled the eye of a beautiful woman, lucid, clear, and seductive. According to legend, the Crescent Moon Spring was formed by a thirsty general. It's said that during the Han Dynasty, General Li Guanli and his men were traveling through the perilous desert when the soldiers became too thirsty to continue their march. So General Li drew his sword and thrust it into the side of the mountain, forming the Crescent Moon Spring. Surrounded by the unforgiving sands of the Taklamakan Desert, the springs were a welcome relief for travelers along the Silk Road. Over the centuries, more than 100 temples and pavilions were constructed along the south side of the spring. The oasis became an inspiration to generations of artists and poets, painters and musicians. Visitors would stroll around the lake, watching fish swim leisurely in the water, and always in the background were the sand dunes, towering more than 300 feet into the sky. Incredibly, sand has never smothered the spring. For thousands of years, the unique orientation of the massive mountains of sand has funneled the prevailing wind up and over the dune crests, away from the cherished pool. But the ever-shifting sand is not the biggest problem facing the local government. The Crescent Moon Spring is now only about a third of its original size. That's why the city of Dunhuang is putting in place measures to restore the water supply to the historic oasis and protect its ecological environment. An emergency treatment project has successfully increased the water table in the vicinity of the oasis. But work has also begun to preserve all of Dunhuang's precious water resources. Local officials introduced a policy known as the 3 Forbids, banning new wells, new farmland, and new migrants. the Crescent moon spring has endured in the desert for thousands of years. With careful management, it will continue to be enjoyed by generations to come. Conservation is crucial because Dunhuang has emerged as one of the leading destinations for travelers in Western China. But Dunhuang is being transformed by more than just tourism. In the desert, the scarcity of water may make agriculture unsustainable, but Western China is booming, thanks to a resource it has in abundance: sunshine. Dunhuang is becoming famous for renewable energy. For more than 2,000 years, the ancient fortifications of Dunhuang have baked in the searing sun. Dunhuang is one of the sunniest places in China, with over 3,200 hours of sunlight a year. That's why the city of Dunhuang has an ambitious plan to cover more than 1,350 square miles of the Gobi Desert with solar panels. Prompted by a national decision to diversify the nation's energy production portfolio and to reduce carbon emissions, Dunhuang is pursuing clean energy development with a ferocity unrivaled in the world. This is the largest photovoltaic power generator in China and the first large-scale solar plant connected to China's transmission grid. Set among the sand dunes are 7 banks of dark blue panels that stretch the length of a running track, capable of generating 10 megawatts, enough to power 10,000 houses. In China, solar generating capacity is expected to jump from less than 1 gigawatt in 2010 to more than 20 gigawatts by 2020. As China invests billions to remake itself into a green energy superpower, Dunhuang is set to become a world leader in environmentally friendly technologies. Over the centuries, many important scientific and technological innovations migrated along the Silk Road. Dunhuang has always been the place where East met West. Today, visitors to Dunhuang travel in air-conditioned comfort. But things were very different for Xuanzang, a Buddhist monk traveling the Silk Road in 629 AD. He wrote of a bleak and empty desert where travelers stacked up the bleached bones of human skeletons to form signposts in the sand. It took the monk 17 years to travel from China to India and back along the Silk Road. Great caravans of camels continued to make the perilous journey until late in the 15th century with the discovery of a sea route connecting Europe to Asia. An oasis in a sea of sand, Dunhuang was perfectly positioned to become an intercontinental think tank of human ingenuity. Today, thanks to its extreme climate and developments in energy technology, Dunhuang could once again show the world a better way to live in one of the harshest environments on the planet, deep in the land of the dragon.